Welcome to Alter Everything, a podcast about data science and analytics culture. I'm Megan Bowers, and today I'm talking with Michael Keiffer, Alteryx training specialist and independent data analysis consultant. In this episode, we chat about applying data analytics in auditing, where internal audit shops face challenges, and how Alteryx is bridging the gap. Let's get started. Hey, Mike, it's great to have you on our show today. Thanks so much for joining. Could you give a quick introduction to yourself for our listeners?
Oh, sure. Mike Keiffer. Currently, I'm working as a training specialist for Alteryx. I've been an Alteryx user since January of 2020. I was appointed an Alteryx ACE in August of 2024. So, celebrating my 1 year ACE anniversary this month. One of my goals when I first started using Alteryx was to someday become an ACE. So, I was really excited to realize that goal last August. I own my own company, MPK Data Analytics, and I've been providing data analytics, consulting, and training services since 2004, primarily through my own company, but I've also worked as a contractor for other software providers such as ACL and IDEA. In fact, I'm still currently working as a contractor for IDEA. I don't do as much training work for them. So I've been doing this work for over 20 years. My career started as a bank internal auditor. For the first 15 years or so of my career, I worked as a bank internal auditor. I also worked for a spell for American Express. And then prior to starting my own company, I worked for a company here in Phoenix, Arizona, that's where I'm based, called Avnet. They're basically in supply chain distribution. So again, a very different environment compared to a bank internal auditing.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really interested to hear more about your experience in the audit field and your experience being an analytics consultant there. So, I think a good spot to start out would be I'd like to just hear about how you view the role of analytics in auditing.
I think analytics and internal auditing, or actually auditing in general, but especially internal auditing, is a super huge component. But I think it's something that a lot of internal audit shops are not actively utilizing as effectively or as often as they could. It can definitely help develop more meaningful audit findings because without data analytics, like coming from a banking environment where the focus was on audit budgets, we did a lot of sampling where you would take a sample of 50 items or 75 items, do your testing, and then you go and present your findings to the audit client or the auditee. And you weren't looking at like the entire population of transactions because the data was so large and most folks either didn't have the time or didn't have the tools or resources to look at the entire data population. So they were doing a lot of sampling. But I've often found that when you're presenting an audit finding, saying, we looked at a sample of 50 items and found 5 exceptions. By the time you get done with that sentence, the audit client is starting to nod off because it's not really terribly exciting to say we found 5 errors out of 50 transactions. When you say we looked at 50 million transactions and found, exceptions totaling tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of exceptions, findings like that tend to have a little bit more weight than the standard. We've had a sample of 50 or 75. So I think internal data analytics rather an internal audit will allow internal audit shops or audit shops to do more, and I think maybe develop more complete audit findings because they're looking at the entire population and not just a sample of data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, like when you see people doing smaller samples, like samples of 50, what kind of tools are they using for that versus maybe traditional analytics tools?
I see a lot of folks using Excel, and it's really hard, especially within the internal audit world. I think just like I think in data analytics in general, it's hard to get people to let go of that death grip on Excel and start using other tools such as Alteryx because that's what they've had on their computer forever. They're very comfortable with it. But typically, I've seen folks using like Excel to sort their samples. And ironically, when I've taught classes, especially for IDEA, for some reason they want to use IDEA to select samples, even though IDEA gives them that ability to look at the entire data population. A lot of times I get surprised when I ask folks, what would you like me to teach you about idea? Well, how are we going to do like a random sample? I'm thinking, well, I can show you that, but I'd rather show you how to test the entire population and not just a sample of data.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know when we talked before too, you mentioned you're going to conferences a decent amount. I'm curious like what some of your takeaways have been about using data analytics and audits from attending and speaking at some of these conferences.
Yeah, I get invited to appear at a lot of conferences for the Institute of Internal Auditors, the IIA or ISACA, Information and Security and Audit Control. And it seems like the general theme seems to be, help us improve or get better at utilizing data analytics. And typically, one of my questions I'll always ask, no matter where I'm presenting or what the topic is, I'll just say, how many folks here are currently utilizing data analytics? And you'll see maybe 75% of the hands will shoot up. And I'll say, how many folks are happy with how they're utilizing data analytics? Are you happy with where you're currently at with your desire to utilize data analytics more effectively? Then maybe out of that 75, you'll see 45 or 50 hands go up. Then I'll say how many folks are not happy at all, or you feel like you're not hitting your objectives with utilizing data analytics. And I'll see a lot more hands go up there. But it seems like the general prevailing theme is folks want to be better than where they're currently at today, and a whole variety of reasons for why they're not being successful. But no matter what presentation I'm doing, I often will put up a slide that will say, in 2025, what's the biggest challenge facing internal auditors? And that's the effective use of data analytics. And I'll say, I've been using this slide for about 15 years. And I just simply changed the date. That's 2012. Now we're up to 2025, but it's like that's always the ongoing conversation is that's at least my takeaway as internal audit shops want to get better at data analytics. And I think there's a whole host of reasons as to why they're not successful doing that. But that seems to be the general thing.
Yeah, what do you think some of those reasons are, some of the challenges unique to internal audit?
I think for me, like when I first began an internal audit, I had a very forward thinking audit manager who she recognized very early on that data analytics was going to be big, whether you were an internal audit or just in general, it was going to be big for your organization. So she was really good at trying to kind of mesh data analytics with internal audit, kind of employing a good understanding of the business objectives, but how that related to the actual data. So the IT folks could tell you what kind of issues the systems were having or any breakdowns there, but they really couldn't relate the data to the business objectives. Whereas the internal auditors had a pretty good understanding of what the business objectives were for the company, but they really couldn't like map that over to the actual mapping that with the data or doing data analytics. Because I think really where a lot of shops fall short is a lot of times internal auditors don't know how to align their business objectives with what I call the data objectives. What data will you need electronically to start knocking out these different tests that you've lined up? And I think there's like a disconnect between what the business does and how it actually relates to their data. So I think that's often one of the biggest disconnects.
I think you do see that in all sorts of departments throughout organizations, the disconnect between the people who know about the data and then those that control it or manage it. So that can always be a challenge for sure. But I think that was interesting what you said about identifying the data objectives in addition to your test and audit objectives.
Sometimes too, the disconnect can be like where to go to get the data or who to talk to. So I always oftentimes I will encourage the internal auditors, find out who the gatekeepers are, the folks that control the data, that have access to the data. And then you want to make them your biggest, bestest buddy. You really want to develop those good relationships because those they can really make or break your audit project. So as a good example for that, Avnet, the company that I mentioned, we use an off-the-shelf mainframe system called Genesis that they made a lot of modifications to over the years. And there really wasn't a whole lot of documentation nearby that actually told you about the system. But we had one person, her name is Ida Vio. I still remember her name to this day. And I made her my best buddy in the whole world. Anytime we did anything, even remotely touched the Genesis system, she was the first person we called because she knew where to find everything. So a lot of times as I was mapping up or trying to align my test objectives with the data objectives, I would call her. And for example, we were looking to see we had some vendors who were being miscoded as being exempt from paying sales tax because they were a reseller. So I just simply called that and said, okay, I'm trying to do some analytics on our vendors here. We're having some issues where we were getting assessed tax penalties, interest and penalties, and back taxes because we had vendors that were set up as resellers, tax exempt, but in reality, they really were not. And so she essentially showed me exactly where to go, what system, what fields to look at to identify who were properly set up as tax exempt vendors and who weren't. I could ask her the business questions. She could give me the specific answers within the data where to find or how to test for those business questions.
That's really interesting. Seems like there I had another conversation recently around the need for almost like a translator translating between the business needs and then the data sources you already have. So identifying those people at your company. Ideally there would be documentation, but so many times there isn't. And I experienced that at a previous company as well, where even after I left that company, I got messages of, "Hey, do you remember what's in this table?" I'm like, "You guys gotta start documenting that." But either way, it's definitely a need, and you do need to, like, rely on those people and identify kind of your key stakeholders there. But yeah, I like that example. Do you have any other examples of, like, untapped opportunities to leverage data analytics in auditing?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the operative key word is I think there are just numerous untapped opportunities just because I don't think folks really realize what's there. So as an example, I have one restaurant, Texas Roadhouse, one of my clients. And so I actually asked that same question. I said, what kind of data analytics are you currently running right now? And there's like this long pause in the room and someone said, well, that's what you're here for. We're hoping you could tell us what we should be doing with data analytics. And that really took me by surprise because I'm thinking to myself, in all of your audits, not employing data analytics should be the exception and not the rule. And you really don't even have to think that hard about where to start employing data analytics. So I answered his question with the question. I said, well, do you have employees? He said, well, of course we do. Do you have vendors at your company? Are you making payments to those vendors? And I said, well, one thing you could do right off the bat would be like a duplicate accounts payable where you're making duplicate AP payments to your vendors. You could do that test tomorrow. If you have employees, you can compare your employees to vendors and vice versa. A big risk there is looking to see, do you have employees who are masquerading as vendors or vice versa because of a conflict of interest? I said, do your employees travel? You could review their travel and entertainment expenses. If you're using procurement cards or P cards, you could look at P card purchases for personal transactions. In fact, a friend of mine had just got done putting together a dashboard using Power BI. And I believe American Express was the credit card vendor for his company. And he showed me a list of, I think, by transaction amount spends using their P cards. And the number one hit for the most dollars was like a racing simulation vendor. And I said, Greg, do me a favor on that one little table there. Pivot that from doing the highest dollars to the volume of transactions, total number of transactions. So I had a feeling before he even changed the dashboard, I knew that if he goes from total dollars to number of transaction, volume of transactions, I figured Apple, iTunes, or the iTunes store and Amazon would be in the top three, and they both were. Without even seeing the data, I knew right off the bat, just by knowing like human nature, I figured you probably have some employees there who are using their P card because the mentality might be it's a small dollar amount, it's going to fly below the radar, no one's going to notice it. So you see different things like that. So I really think, for some reason, think that employing data analytics that they're within their internal audits is a hard endeavor. And I try to encourage them is actually really easier than you think. If you have a general ledger, there's a whole host of data analytics you can do on your general ledger. Geo entries that don't balance, manual entries that look suspect. You see a lot of postings to the suspense account or miscellaneous. You might want to take a peek at that. If you have a lot of folks making geo postings after quarter end close or year end close, you might want to take a look at that. So,
Sounds
uh,
suspicious.
yeah, so there's really a lot of, like I said, I would think it would be harder to not do data analytics on an internal audit than to try to find a way to employ data analytics. And what I would call the low hanging fruit, all companies have vendors, employees, they're making payments to those vendors. They have a general ledger system access. Don't even get me started on system access. But again, everything is controlled by data. And if you work for a bank or a healthcare client or a hospital system, that data is obviously very secure. Of course, there's going to be a lot of confidential data. And if you're in healthcare, there's actually regulations, HIPAA, surrounding the protection of that data. Just doing a system access review, looking to see how many of your employees have access to your data after they've been terminated is a really good test to do. If you have a disgruntled employee that has a lot of system access after they've been terminated, they can do a lot of damage to your company. And that's why I always say it's really important to make sure your employees are gruntled as opposed to disgruntled. You want happy employees.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm curious to hear too about maybe some success stories that you've seen for people and companies using Alteryx for some of those data analytics challenges, for some maybe transforming some audit processes. Like, where have you seen people have success?
One success story I want to say right off the bat is Arizona Blue Cross and Blue Shield. We're talking about how they were getting a lot of information, a lot of data from PDF files. And so they were having people manually grabbing the data from those PDF files. I think they were like typing the data into like an Excel spreadsheet to get answers to different questions from these scanned PDF files. And then using a Designer and Intelligence Suite, they can read in those scanned PDF documents. They can scrape the data from those PDFs. And the manager that was doing that process said last year they saved like 935,000 man hours from what was a very manual process of just literally going through those PDFs. And I know internal audit shops, they get a lot of PDF files. Those are kind of like the file type I tell them try to avoid if at all possible. But if you have Alteryx and Intelligence Suite, you can actually use those files fairly effectively.
Yeah, I honestly can't imagine working with PDFs without a tool like Alteryx and Intelligence Suite. It sounds really tedious to have to sort through PDFs to me. So that's a huge one. That's crazy time savings too,
Oh
like
yeah, my guess.
inconceivable amount of time saved.
Yeah, I thought 935,000 is a pretty big number, but I know like I said, PDFs can be a tedious process. And then another one going back to bank system access testing using Alteryx. I had a banking client that they wanted to review system access for all their employees across the entire bank. And then what they also wanted to do was they wanted to prepare a list of individual employees by manager, showing their branch or department, all their employees under them, who was required to have a system access review. And they also want to create an email where they wanted to email these reports for their the employees coming up for a system access review automatically. So I developed a workflow in Alteryx that could actually go through, read through the data. The data was very messy because what they had was like this text file, and they had the system access templates embedded with the actual system access assigned to the individual employees. So you had to basically separate the system access for a bank teller, a branch manager, a loan officer from the actual templates, the access that was actually granted by the individual employees, and then compare to see did they have the right access based on their role within the bank. So if you're a bank teller, you might have access to different applications than say from an admin assistant or a branch manager. And so I think at the end of the day, I created close to, I think 350 plus individual Excel files. And then each one of those files was emailed automatically. I had a list, I did a separate little macro, had a list of the managers who were supposed to be receiving these reports, automated the process of not only creating these Excel files from pretty messy data, but also automatically emailing the appropriate a manager within the bank. I think they told me they were spending, I think, 6 to 9 weeks with up to 6 employees doing this once a year, very manual process, took over 2 plus months. And I think we timed it a couple of times, how long it took the macro, the workflow in Designer to run. And I think the longest it took was like a minute and a half. In fact, when I got on the phone call to present my findings, so I'm going to go ahead and kick off the workflow and I'll hit the run button. And I barred off the folder where it's going to show where all the Excel files were going to be placed in. Folder was empty. So I said, okay, Shannon, where should I send the files? And she's like, they're done. I go, yeah. She goes, no, they're not. I go, yes, they are. No, it's not. Yes, it took me longer to convince her that the workflow I finished running than it actually took for the workflow to complete. But she really could not believe that it actually ran as quickly as it did, going from, 2 plus, almost a 2 month process once a year to literally the workflow ran, like I said, about a minute, 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's just crazy productivity gains. It seemed like, yeah, your first example, being able to unlock like new file formats like PDFs, being able to like read those more systematically and process those, as well as just like automating other processes like emailing. That's very cool. I'm
Yeah,
sure
that
that
part they
there's,
really liked because again, they literally, I said, as long as they could find the workflow and hit run, they could put it on the server. I think they were looking at getting Alteryx service to get to simply run that workflow from server. So that way they could just schedule it, just have it do its thing. They wouldn't even have to touch Designer. But yeah, they couldn't believe it how easy and effective Alteryx was at doing that work, especially given how the structure of the file was actually pretty messy. System access reports are kind of like PDFs. They can be a little bit on the tedious side to work because they're not super structured in terms of, the format of the data.
yeah. Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about some of the differences between an Alteryx workflow and an Excel workbook that's been like really, has a lot of formulas, has a whole process, just for folks that are unfamiliar with Alteryx, like the repeatability and scalability of that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was doing another training class where I was going through and demonstrating basically processes you would do in Excel and how those would translate to Alteryx. And at one point, someone said, we can do this in Excel. Why would I need to do this in Alteryx? I say, that's a fair question. Let's say you put in all your formulas here, maybe even have like a pivot table or two, some different reporting outputs here. Once you're done with that, you have that process done, but it's basically static just for the data that you put in. So now you want to do that for next month's data coming in. How would you basically replicate that process? Or maybe you want to automatically feed that data into your workbook, apply those formulas, do your pivots and all that. And there's that long pause, and someone goes, I could write a macro in Excel. I said, yeah, you would have to write a program in Excel, a macro, using Visual Basic is the language that you would use in Excel to automate that process. And I've done some work with Visual Basic, and it's a not a bad programming language, but again, you have to essentially know how to code to automate that process. And I said, well, now in Designer here, once you have that workflow built, guess what? Now it's automated. It's very easy to simply swap out the old data for the new data, but you can easily now pull new data into your workflow, set up a macro to automate that process if you'd like. But once you're done building the workflow, not only is your data analytics completed, but you've actually built the automation at the same time. And I think, especially for folks in internal audit, that's where the game changer is at with Designer, because you don't have to take that second step to now go back and write a program or write a script or write a macro to automate that process.
Yeah, 100%. And you don't have to know how to code, which is huge, especially if you create this process and you do have to hand it off to someone in the future who, might not have the VBA skills that you have. I see that as like a huge win for sure with the automation piece.
Think you kind of mentioned before why a lot of audit shops maybe weren't embracing data analytics. And I think that's because coming from working with a lot of folks that were initially using ACL, ACL was the same way. It'd be like a two-step process. You could run the analytics manually through the user interface, but then if folks wanted to automate that process, you would have to build, again, a fairly involved script. My old training manager at ACL, Michael Cana, was actually the one who said, have you heard of Alteryx? He was actually the one that made me aware that Alteryx was even out there. And I think when I saw the transpose tool run for the first time, I was like, okay, you've got to be kidding me, because doing this in ACL involved a very complicated script to pivot data from horizontal to vertical, one tool on the canvas. And for me, it's like, okay, this is definitely a better
Good.
mousetrap.
I'm sold. Yeah, that's awesome. So, what would your advice be for auditors who are looking to get started with Alteryx and get started doing some more analytics and automation for their processes?
I would say the first thing they would want to do is Alteryx does have the trial license. So I would definitely say get the trial license, and then joining the Alteryx user community, and then just seeing what some folks have posted there about different ways to employ data analytics in an internal audit environment. Maybe do some of the weekly challenges, start doing some of the interactive lessons that they have there to get that exposure, and maybe even pick like a project, something that you would do in Excel or something that you're fairly comfortable doing, and then try and do that same project in Alteryx and see how that goes and getting the feedback from that process alone. But I think for folks that are more visual, especially for internal auditors, seeing the workflow set up, having the tools on the canvas, seeing how the data progresses through that workflow visually, I think folks can probably relate to that much better than just seeing raw data in an Excel spreadsheet. So.
Yeah, yeah, you can start to see what transformations are happening and go back. That's something I've heard from people is the ability to like go back 3 steps, look at the data there, see what happened. Whereas sometimes in Excel, you already created a new column or like reformatted some existing thing, and it's like, oh no, I lost that data kind of thing. And so I think that's good advice to try it out with an existing Excel process that you have and see what it could look like in Designer.
Yeah, when I first started working with my sales rep at Alteryx, that was actually one of the first things that I did was I got my trial license, and I took an audit or a process that I did using ACL, and I put that through Designer. And like I said, it took one project for me to realize, okay, this is a better a better mousetrap. And again, I think with the way Designer is laid out, the one tool examples, there's just so many great resources that are there to really help minimize that learning curve. And I tell folks, you can be very, very productive with Designer literally in a matter of hours as opposed to days, weeks, or months, or maybe even longer. Some folks never even get there with tools like ACL or IDEA. They never really get to where they want to be. So,
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks so much, Mike, for coming on the podcast. It's been really interesting to hear about your field and all of your expertise. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Megan. Thank you for having me. So I really enjoyed being a part of the podcast. So it was definitely my pleasure to be here. So thank you.
Thanks for listening. To connect with Michael, head over to our show notes on alteryx.com/podcast. And if you like this episode, leave us a review. See you next time.